Welcome, everybody, to the Middleton Elite Entrepreneur Podcast, where we're deconstructing elite performance in real estate, business, and life through candid conversations with business leaders and thought leaders. I'm your host, Bill Middleton, the founder of Middleton Elite Coaching, and I'm glad to have you here. Let's get started. And I'm excited to be joined today by my good friend, Sheri Horvath, who is also the Director of Operations for MEC. And today's episode is going to be a little bit different because we get to know a little bit about me and how Middleton Elite Coaching came to be and the great work we're doing with a lot of you out there in the real estate and entrepreneurial space. So without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, Bill, I know I speak for both of us when I say we're excited to dive into everything Middleton Elite Coaching, from its history to where we're headed, including what we can expect from this podcast. I love that you're in the hot seat today. So I always enjoy hearing you tell others how you ended up in real estate, and even more, some stories about when you made the decision to hire your very first real estate coach. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and letting us know a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sheri. I like the hot seat. I like the pressure. It sounds fun. I wish I had a story about purposefully getting into real estate, but the reality is I sort of fell into it. I'll say, though, that there's a little bit of a common thread amongst most things that I've done, and that is continuing to work hard and then pursuing things that feel right in the moment. Maybe that's something we come back to later. Prior to real estate, though, I was in the restaurant business. At the end of that, I ran a large private restaurant group, and I kind of had my head down, working the 60, 70, sometimes 80-hour weeks like many people who are from restaurants or hospitality or something like that have done. And the last entity that we did was a private city club, and a lady who is still a dear friend of mine, and I'm very thankful for her. She asked me what I now call the $1 million question. And I call it the $1 million question because thankfully it's been worth that and much more to me and my family. The question was really simple, though, and that was, have you ever thought about a career in real estate? Now, let me rabbit trail here for just a second. I'll come back to the story. We'll probably rabbit trail a fair amount today. I think we bump into talented people every day. And I think that if our listeners were really purposeful about observing the people around them daily, weekly, they would bump into a small handful, maybe a large handful of people who really should be in real estate, who really should be candidates for their teams. I had basically no awareness of real estate as a career, had certainly not considered it for myself until I got that question. This was in 2008, which you don't have to be a history major to know was actually probably not the best time to launch a new career in real estate. As it turns out, it was a great time for me. We'll touch more on that later. But this lady, and I will also say, I'm intentionally not going to mention names throughout this because selectively these people will come back probably as future podcast guests. And I couldn't possibly name all of the people who have been very instrumental in me reaching the level that I have right now in my journey. So all respect to everyone. Disclaimer. Hopefully we'll have many of you on as future podcast guests. In South Carolina at the time, though, you could go from running a restaurant to being a real estate professional in 2 weeks. So that's what I did. I went to a 2-week-long sort of summer school-ish program, got my real estate license hot off the press. The lady who got me into the business was, and still is actually, the owner of the number one firm in that town. Went to work for her. A lot of great people in that firm. Some of them are still friends. A couple of them are actually clients of ours now, which is a fun kind of full circle thing, 15 going on 16 years later. And I will tell you, though, Sheri, I really struggled in my first year, not only because this thing called the Great Recession was just starting to happen, but also because what I was at the time what Zig Ziglar used to call a motivated idiot. And even if you haven't heard Zig talk about that or heard him talk about it in the past, you could surmise that what a motivated idiot is, and that is somebody who is willing to work really hard but has no clue what they're doing. And I had brought this sort of ingrained work ethic that had been built throughout my life into real estate, which was awesome because I was accustomed to working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And it would come as no surprise to the people who are listening to this. Most real estate agents are not willing to put in that amount of work. However, it wasn't just the work. So other little rabbit trail here. We talk often about the 3 things that people can control. And number one is their mindset / attitude. Number two is the effort that they're willing to put into something. And number three is the skill with which they do it. I had sort of checked box number one because I was naive enough and brash enough in my mid-20s to think that I was just going to go set the world on fire. I was definitely checking box number two, which was the effort, because that was hardwired into me. The thing that I was woefully missing, and the market just put a spotlight on this for me, was that my skills were really low. Let's fast forward a little bit, because you had asked a question about me hiring my first coach. In the fall of 2009, I went to a large conference for a franchise real estate company that I was about to become a part of. And keep in mind, this was the worst real estate market since the Great Depression. And there were people on the stage who were describing what they were doing, and they'd been having the best years of their lives. And I was 26, 27 years old at the time. And I was probably just dumb enough to think that I could go home and do what they did. And I say that with both humility and accuracy, because I went home and basically said, okay, I was pretty much ready to give up on real estate. This was 13, 14 months into it. I'd made $18,000 in my first 13 months in the business. Fortunately, Sarah, my wife, was still teaching school at the time. We didn't have any kids yet, so our expenses were pretty low. We were able to kind of get by. Ate a lot of Taco Bell, but that's a different story. And came home, though, and said, like, okay, if these people can do it, then so can I. What does that pathway look like? And each of these people were really plugged into training and growth and learning and coaching and all of these things that seem really duh now. And in fact, at the moment also seemed like, well, I guess that makes sense, because in my background as a baseball player, I had a lot of that as well. So sort of pulling all of that forward, I'm in this training class in, this would have been January of 2010. So I've been at it about a year and a half now, January 2010. And I'm introduced to this idea that real estate agents actually have coaches. The idea of coaching made perfect sense to me for reasons I just discussed. The only problem was I had no money, like no money. And at the time, to get involved in coaching, this particular program started at $450 a month. And I go on break from this training class, and I looked at my credit card online to see how much available credit I had. I called Sarah, who was keenly aware that we had no money and were rapidly accumulating debt, and said, I know we only have $700 of available credit on this credit card, but I think I want to hire a real estate coach. And after like the audible gasp and the likely eye roll, she was actually very supportive. I'm being silly now. We decided that we were going to go for it. There's a common thread here, and I'll brag on Sarah for just a second. There's a common thread here where there is unwavering support in the face of calculated risk. And I saw it as a calculated risk because one of two things was going to happen. Either I was going to get better quickly, or I was going to go back to restaurants. And fast forward through training, through working with my coach, who became, he and his wife sort of became my real estate parents, if you will, ended up having a tremendous amount of success relative to the market in 2010, which then put me on the journey for brokerage firm leadership and led to some of the things that we're doing today, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. So if we pick up the story in 2010, that final full year in sales for me, I before moving into brokerage firm leadership, I would say if I reflect on it, the great news is I added that third piece, the skills piece. And there's a phrase we use a lot in coaching these days about how the market should not determine if we're successful or not, but the market can dictate how to be successful. If you go back to that year, you'll recall that there were a lot of short sales. There were a lot of foreclosures. There were a lot of expired listings. There was sometime in 2010, 2011, my memory's a little fuzzy on it, but there's a first-time homebuyer tax credit that pulled forward first-time homebuyer demand. And so my business reflected a lot of that. did a lot of FSBO and expired work, did a lot of REO and short sale work. And obviously that's a very different market than the one that we're in today, and also really sort of intellectually interesting. Since we said we're going to be candid in conversations, to be candid, the main reason that I decided to get out of real estate sales, and this quote will hurt me if I ever pursue a political career, however, I'll say it anyway, I have a really low tolerance for stupid people. And what I learned in working with the general public is that there are a lot of stupid people out there. And okay, maybe I didn't make any friends by what I just said. That doesn't mean that they're bad people. I think people are great just the way they are for the most part. And I would also bet that a lot of people listening to this have been frustrated a time or two with working with buyers or sellers. And perhaps I hadn't been in it long enough, or perhaps I was just too young to be polished enough to care. But this idea of building businesses, this idea of having a larger impact on entrepreneurs and businesses felt a lot more fulfilling to me than continuing to sell houses. And I say felt because this is maybe a common thread for me. I often get asked the question, like, what do you think is going to happen if you do X? Or what do you hope to accomplish by doing Y or Z? And sometimes, candidly, I don't know. It's like, I mean, I could come up with a range of possible things, which is important for strategy. My opinion, though, is that there are just times where the culmination of working hard, putting yourself in the right position, and trusting some degree of intuition, and then going through with it. I think Steve Jobs talked about this a little bit in a commencement address he did at Stanford. This would have been like in the early 2000s, where he basically said, like, looking forward, it's really hard to predict with any degree of accuracy what's going to happen. Looking backward, it's really easy to connect the dots. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I think there's a little bit of, how would I describe it? I think there's a little bit of freedom in being able to say, I don't actually have to have it all figured out. What I need to feel confident about is that the next step is a step in the right direction. And it's a step in the right direction for what matters for me and for the people that I care about the most. And the chips will largely fall where they will fall as long as I continue with the mindset, the effort, and the skill development. So all that's to say, I went from not really liking the general public, which is probably still true, to looking at this more of like, if I drew out two futures, one of which is building a real estate sales team, and the other is building brokerage firms and coaching those people and developing those people who are building real estate sales teams, which one sounds more fun? Which one lights my fire more? And that's what led me into leading brokerage firms, which I did for almost 5 years.
Yeah. You definitely have, just from knowing you the way that I do, I know that coaching, training, sharpening skills is definitely your passion project. And so I'm more than certain that that's what inspired you to create Middleton Elite Coaching. So what were some of your motivations and aspirations after you started building brokerage firms that led you to want more?
Yeah, I mean, I think to fill in some of these things, one of my early mentors in this business, who's still a great friend, at one point I was sort of at this crossroads and I asked him what I should do. And he very simply said, just go where you can impact the most people. And this thought of exponential impact is one that I think I keep coming back to and looking for other ways to keep pushing that button. And it's easy to say, like, this is something bigger than just about me or about us. I do believe that to be true, though. So I spent roughly 5 years running brokerage firms, was fortunate to work with a lot of great people during that period of time. We grew wildly in the two firms that I was a part of. That led to an opportunity for me to become a national sales trainer for that large franchise company, which I did for about 2 years. And I spent 120 to 150 days a year on the road for a 2-year period. This will kind of lead to your question about how Middleton Elite Coaching was born. And it was another great era of my life. I mean, I owe a lot of thanks to to everybody in that first kind of 7, 8, 10 years of my real estate career. However, in all of my travels, I loved everything that I was doing when I was in the room, so to speak. I was there working with agents, working with entrepreneurs, working with team leaders, et cetera. And these were, depending on the event, 50 to 5,000 people. And I loved everything about it in the room. And the moment I walked out the door and it went from rental cars to airports to hotels and rinse and repeat, like I said, 120 to 150 days a year, that will absolutely wear on anybody. And if you've never done it before, people would say, well, that sounds like a really glamorous thing. You get to see all these different cities and all these different things. And that newness wore off really quickly. At the time, our boys were very little. Our oldest was, when I started that, he was 4. And our youngest was 2, and our third was not yet born. So let's talk defining moments for just a second, because the actual catalyst for starting Middleton Elite Coaching had nothing to do with business and everything to do with personal. To backfill for just a second, I'd been kicking around the idea of leaving where I was and starting my own thing. I'd learned about myself early on and maybe just began to realize it in that era that one of the things I value the most is autonomy. And little rabbit trail here, one of the, as you know, Sheri, one of the tools that we use and some framework we use is referred to as the 4 tendencies. And in Gretchen Rubin's work of the 4 tendencies, I very highly identify with the tendency of rebel. And her definition of a rebel, don't quote me on this verbatim, but it's pretty close, is you can't tell me what to do and neither can I. And the you can't tell me what to do is the pushback on figures of authority and the desire for autonomy. There's a long thread, for better or worse, in my life of that. And the I can't tell me what to do in Rubin's definition is this idea of sort of always looking for the next thing, for seeing things sooner and being willing to pursue them, even perhaps when others aren't or are confused about the decision to do that. So anyway, I've been sort of kicking around the idea of starting my own thing. I hadn't fully committed to it. Sarah and I had talked about it some. And I remember this vividly. My typical schedule was I'd be gone. I'd leave on Sunday afternoons. I'd come back on Thursday afternoons. Now, sometimes it was a little lighter, but that was kind of the heaviest of the schedule. 4 different cities over 4 days, back home on Thursdays. And our boys were 4, 2, and Sarah was like 8 months pregnant. And I walk out the front door on a Friday morning to pick up the Wall Street Journal out of the driveway. I'm still old school that way, and I still get the print copy of the Wall Street Journal. Of course, I look at the digital thing too, but I'm still a little old school that way. I walk in the front door, I pick up the paper, I'm walking back up the driveway, and I hear our oldest son, who's 4 at the time, just wailing, screaming inside the house. Door was closed inside the house. And I thought, he fell down the steps or, something happened, some sort of injury related thing. I come running back up the driveway, open the door. Sarah's there with him, consoling him. And I said, buddy, what's wrong? And he said, and I quote, "Why are you always leaving?"
That'll break your heart.
Yeah. And I just walked down the driveway to get the paper, yet here we are at 4.5. His perception of me when I walked out the door was that I was leaving and he wasn't sure when I was going to be back. So after we calmed everybody down and I kind of got over being rattled by the question, that was the decision. We made the decision inwardly. We made the decision then. And then, logistically, it took a little while for that to work out, a couple of months from that event to wrap up what I was doing and to, do so gracefully and respectfully with the company that I had left. And that was the personal defining moment that caused us to start Middleton Elite Coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've established you are a fan of calculated risk. And you're also a fan of exponential impact. So I know from firsthand that the work that we're doing involves both of those things. So I can only imagine that there have been, as with any business venture, I'm sure there are points of accomplishment and also aspects that were proving to be more challenging than others. So I know that, we're in year 7 now, but it wasn't always as easy with as much momentum as we have today. What have been some of the more pivotal defining moments for you in just trying to follow your passion and create something the way that you have?
Mm-hmm. I will say that, and I think probably most listening to this would say the first year or two of anything new is harder than anyone would expect.
Definitely.
And I often say to people, like, I jumped out of a very comfortable big red airplane with a very small parachute. And it was almost like, I mean, and the risk profile was very different then, like leaving restaurants to start real estate, to start a real estate career in what turned out to be a recession, big recession. The risk was low there because we were just in a different stage of life, and there was always a door open to go back to. And I suppose there was technically a door to open to go back to other things, but we really took this like burn the ships approach on this because it felt to me like it had to be done for our family first. And I would also say that the reason we chose to focus on elite, the reason we chose to focus on sort of highly detailed and customized, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later today, was I felt like there was just a big gap in that in our industry. So candidly, I mean, the first year to year and a half was really difficult. I will say I'm very thankful for some of the OGs that we still coach who joined us in 2017, because they were both they were willing to take the risk to join us at that point in time based on an idea and kind of my track record of and the relationship with them. But we didn't have any of the stuff that we have today. And I don't think we're on some mountaintop right now either, just to be clear. Like, I think those of you who know me well know, really looking at this more as a journey, and we're in a lot better spot today, thanks to Sheri and a number of others who we'll talk about today as well. We're in a much better spot today than we were 7 years ago. I'll tell you kind of a fun story, though, about how we decided, and maybe there's something instructive in this for the listeners as well. For better or worse, I've always gone through life sort of bookmarking people in my brain. And I thought, okay, this person, let's go back to the talent thing for just a second. I observe this person, I interact with this person, and I think to myself, if there's ever an opportunity to be in business with that person, I want to look to do that. It's not an exact science, but it's like little bookmark. And this would have been like the summer of 17 when Sarah and I had kind of fully baked the idea that we were going to go do this. Then the question became like, am I going to do this by myself, or am I going to bring other people into doing this? I'm a team sports guy. I'm a collaborative guy. I don't mind being the leader. In fact, I embrace that. I like being the captain of a team versus a solo performer. All right, so what are we going to do with that? And I went through and thought of a handful of people, that a small handful of people that I had bookmarked, and I called them and I said, here's what I'm doing. And if you're interested, come to my house for a weekend and I'll lay out sort of what I'm thinking. And at the end, if you want to be a part of it, then you're welcome to join me, and I hope you will. And if not, no harm, no foul. And so a number of people, including my former partner, Debbie, who's still a great friend, and a couple others came, and we spent the weekend together basically saying, where do we think the gaps are in the business and what would be the most fun things for us to do? And at the end of that, all of them were like, heck yeah, sounds like a great idea. There are 3 other coaches plus me and a director of ops. And we all decided that this is what we're going to go do. Your question though was more about like the hard stuff. I think the hard stuff was like building an airplane while also flying it, which is as risky as it sounds. And yes, nobody's lives were in danger as we were building it whilst flying it. But there's a very practical matter of leaving a very well-paying job that I liked to going to earning zero in a decision, minus some investment income and stuff like that we have. But it wasn't as if we had like a big safety net and this was like, okay, if it works, great, and it doesn't, great. It was like the back's against the wall, purposefully decided to do that. And then the only way out of that was continue to grow, and to grow by delivering value that people would want to refer their friends, that people would gladly continue to be in coaching with us. And like I said, thankfully, a number of those folks from the early days are still with us today. And even those who aren't for various reasons are still good friends and supporters of the company.
Yeah, I know that it's difficult to summarize everything that has gone into not only just the decision to move forward and take that risk and jump out of that really comfortable airplane, to just building something that has substance and value, which I believe we've done very, very well. And so for anyone who may be learning about Middleton Elite Coaching for the first time, tell us a little bit about what it is, what sets it apart from others in your opinion. And then, maybe I really personally love our tailored approach. So hoping to talk a little bit about that today too.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way I'll approach this, and this will go back to the initial meeting that we had in the bonus room of my house, and we were sort of further refining what we thought would be the value proposition of the company. And this has held true still now 7+ years later. Of course, it's in, like version 5 or maybe version 7. But it started with, we said, well, we've all been coached really well before, and we've all had pretty crappy coaches before. Sports, academics, art, music, business, etc. But what are the things of the coaches that we thought did the best? What are the attributes of those coaches? And let's start there. More on that in a second. Then we said, well, where in our business do we feel that there are gaps that perhaps our competitors might not be addressing for whatever reason, philosophical, structural, etc. So I won't speak for anybody else who was in the room at the time, but I'll speak for myself. And I would say that my best coaching experiences throughout life have always been with people who genuinely took an interest in me as a person. They understood what made me tick. They knew what buttons to push, and perhaps even more importantly, what buttons not to push. And they always brought this customized approach, like understanding the way that I wanted to do things and why in this longer term time horizon, this really well sort of counterbalanced marathon of life and work. And it wasn't about like, let's just go sell a bunch of houses just because someone said we should go sell a bunch of houses. Now there's a place for that. And maybe we'll cover that some more later today as well. But this idea of really getting to know the person and getting to know what their longer range plan and vision for themselves and their lives, and then how to grow into that. And interestingly enough, I found that sort of filled some gaps that many of our competitors, I don't know how to say this diplomatically. I think there are a lot of great people in our space. So let me make that as a disclaimer statement. I don't know that most of them are as focused as we are on the individualized approach. My sense from some poor coaching experiences that I've had in the past was that there's this box, and if you're in this box, you're awesome. And if you're not in this box, you're somehow wrong. There are for sure foundational truths to business. However, this idea that there's only one way or a small handful of ways to do things has just never resonated with me. So all that came together and we said, well, what if we did this? What if, because we really enjoy doing it and we really love people, and we said, what if we brought this holistic to be kind of a buzzword about it. What if we brought this holistic approach to things that said, we're going to really focus on getting to know our people as if they were our friends, because we do this long enough together, we're going to become friends, which has turned out to be true. And we get better understanding of where they want to go and why. And if they're not sure, we'll help them figure that out. And then we build that puzzle, and then we work all of that backwards to today. And then we coach them based on that. And it sounds so duh that it's like, shouldn't even seem like an original thought. But our perception was, when we went out and started talking to people, particularly in the real estate business, we went out and started talking to people about this. They were like, that makes perfect sense. I don't know why anybody else isn't doing that. I'm like, yeah, me neither. That's why we're here. But we ran into maybe a little bit of a dilemma, at least in my mind, and that was we were unproven. Yes, we all had very successful track records in other real estate related ventures and leadership and team building and brokerage firm and training, et cetera. But as a company that was like -5 days old at this conversation, the thing to me that was so important was about proof of concept. Like, if I'm going to ask you to hire me to help coach you on your business, I need to be able to prove something. So this is how the launch meeting started. And I said, well, here's what I'd be willing to do. I think there's something to this. I think we're good enough to be able to deliver on it. We're going to do a few things. Someone says they're interested in coaching, and they have the motivation and the momentum and the money to be able to afford it. Then I'm just going to prove it by going to their city and meeting with them and their teams in person and running this, what we now refer to as the launch meeting, running this launch meeting play as I've just described it. And at the end of the meeting, they can decide. And if they think what we designed together is impactful, then it will be natural for them to hire us. And if they think either it was a dumb idea or we're not very good at what we do, then they can say no, and they owe us nothing. And we still do, as you well know, Sheri, we still do launch meetings that way today. In the early days of the company, so this might go back to like some challenges along the way. Like, I'm on airplanes, I'm doing car trips, I'm going to meet people, and there's money going out the door to do those things. I remember vividly one of our early clients, who's still a great friend, lives out on the West Coast, and I was telling her about this launch meeting idea, and she said, so let me get this straight. You're going to get on an airplane and fly to my city over on the East Coast and spend an entire day with me, and I could still say no at the end. I was like, yeah. I mean, it's kind of like a listing appointment. Like, you do this every day. You just don't fly across the country for your listing appointments. You're going to show up. You're going to meet with the seller. You're going to deliver your value proposition. And if it connects with them, you're going to get a signed listing agreement. And if it doesn't, then they're either not going to list or they're going to list with somebody else. And I don't see why this should be so different. And she's like, yeah, that makes sense. So off we go. I think in the history of the company, we've had maybe only 2 or 3 people in 7 years who have decided to opt out at the end of the launch meeting, which I think is both a testament to the process itself and the caliber of coaches on our staff. This is not a place where like somebody who thinks maybe they kind of sort of want to be a coach is on the staff. These are folks with decades of real estate experience that are showing up and delivering that in a very no obligation type format to that person who thinks they want to engage with us. So when I first started doing that in 2017 and into 2018, everybody told me I was an idiot. Not people internally, but externally. The only people who loved the idea were the prospective clients and the people internal to our company. And everybody else wanted to talk to me about the financial risk and the time risk of doing all of these things. And I would just say, like, okay, I hear you, but the downside risk is capped in a flight, in a hotel room, and some time away, et cetera. And if we're striking out on launch meetings all the time, then we need to go back to the drawing board. And if we're winning on launch meetings regularly, then we're onto something. And as it turns out, we were onto something and seem to still be onto something 7+ years later, thankfully.
Yeah, I love it. I think on both sides of the launch meeting, you're betting on yourself, right? And
Right.
so I think just understanding that even if you go across the country and strike out, there's something to be gained from what you learned in striking out. So
Sure.
I know that a lot of those those moments for us and those challenges in the company have shaped the models that we coach to today, the processes by which we onboard clients, and just the general feedback and their success stories. So I love
Right.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've always been, since joining the company, very impressed by our willingness to let the client decide if it works for them with the no obligation, like, hey, if it doesn't work out, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That approach to me feels very win-win.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that's what the relationships that we're building are all about.
Right. Absolutely. I think you make a really important point there. To me, it's about being on the same side of the table, preferably all the time, but certainly as much as possible. Sure, conflict's going to come up from time to time. But if the general stance of our relationships is that we're on the same team, and there are going to be times where you're going to lean on us a little harder, and there are going to be times where we're going to lean on you a little bit harder. But if we start the relationship from the viewpoint of, I genuinely care about you as a person, and we're going to use the launch meeting as a way of accelerating the relationship trust, and then we're going to come up with a really solid strategic plan, it's almost impossible to leave that meeting not feeling aligned. And in the rare example that we might not feel aligned for whatever reason, that's probably a signal that we're not a good fit. And that's okay. Like, we are playing the longest possible game that we can play here. And if we're going to do that, we need to be on the same team.
Yeah, we're essentially in business with you, and you're in business with us. So
Right. Absolutely.
yeah. Hanging out on the topic of growth for our clients for a second,
Mm-hmm.
some of those early successes that allowed you to see that you were making that exponential impact that you so desired to make, both
Mm-hmm.
in the lives and in the businesses of our clients. Is there something that comes to mind for you that kind of stays with you today?
Yes. I'll give you a broad example, and then I'll give you a quick story. I think one of the biggest values in coaches, particularly those who are aligned with you, is they're willing to say the things that they see, and sometimes that might not be the easiest thing to hear. And I'll go back for just a second, and we'll talk about foundational trust in a relationship. So, I'm a big fan of Patrick Lencioni and his work, and this idea that before we can have meaningful conflict with someone, there has to be an established base of trust in the relationship. If you and I don't have trust in the relationship, and you need to grab me by the earlobe and drag me around for a minute, or I need to say something that's maybe a little more direct than I would generally be, we know that at the end of the day, what underpins that is a relationship of care and trust. And I think one of the ways that most people in like the coaching and consulting space fail their clients is they don't spend the time to build that, and instead show up kind of wearing their expert hat and basically say that, like, you should trust me because I'm the expert, which is not necessarily untrue, but the way it lands, I think, is difficult. And instead, if one were to say, like, implied, that I have your best interest in mind, I know that you have my best interest in mind, we have spent the time to build that trust, which is part of the launch meeting and ongoing forever and ever. And based on that, here's some conflict we're about to have. Now, obviously, you're not going to say it that way, but that's the undertone of all of it. And now the conflict lands differently. So here's an example. Guy who's still a client of ours today, great friend, great agent. I do the launch meeting with him. This is in like this summer or fall of 2017. Meet all his team members. We are wrapping up at the end of the launch meeting. It's just me and the owner of the business at this point in time. And the question was sort of like so Bill, what do you think? And I said, the first thing we're going to do is fire your assistant. And I'm very much a people person. I care about people. And so I didn't say this flippantly or lightly, but this is someone who had been on his team for a few years and was doing like a, B- to C+ job at best. But this was a person who, by his own admission at the time, didn't really want to deal with like interpersonal conflict. through coaching and through pushing him, we ultimately were able to let go of that assistant to help place her in a different role in a different organization within his sphere. So there was kind of a graceful exit there. And fast forward over a 7-year period, his team is, I think they probably tripled their gross commission income over that period of time. And there is an inward focus by this particular leader. There's an inward focus on only being in business with A players. I think our teamwork there was to discover this is not an A player, and maybe you kind of already knew it. And now, as both your friend and your coach, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire on this, and we're going to get the C players out of here, and we're going to work on top grading and making sure that we've only got A players, or at a minimum, we've got B players on a growth trajectory to being an A player. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say on that.
No, I love it. So it's going back to your foundational level of trust there and showing up in the way that the client not only needs you to, but you need to for them. It's like that age-old saying, you approach someone, do you want my shoulder or do you want a solution? And I think we do that a lot. And so framing that and early on in the relationship has proven, at least with the clients who are still with us today from those early days, and just establishing that, like, where to show up, when to give them the hard love, when to give them the nudge. One story of a client of ours that comes to mind for me, that I recall is how you successfully helped them navigate growing a team, guiding them through like split structures and implementing a profit sharing component for the salaried admins on their team. And I know we've helped many clients similarly expand their businesses, grow their teams, grow their brokerages. And I know that you probably have a handful of those that stand out in the hearts and minds of you and of our coaches. So speaking of A players, what could someone do? And this is, put your coaching hat on for a second.
Sure.
What is one way that someone can determine and kind of look at their team and assess the A players, as you call them?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind here. The first is about time horizon. I'll use a sports analogy for you. Again, as a baseball guy, the question that I would ponder is, when do I want to win the World Series? And if you're not a sports person, then like, when do I want to be the champion of whatever? When do I desire to be at the absolute top of my game as a business, whatever that represents? And if the answer to that is now or tomorrow, then you cannot afford to have people who aren't A's and A pluses. And that doesn't mean that you must always only have A's and A pluses. That would be a perfect world. But if you were to say, okay, I'm going to focus on growing the organization in a way that allows me to win the World Series 3 years from now, then you might have a little bit of a mixture of A's and A pluses and maybe some B's that are on this growth trajectory. One of the people that I really like reading and listening to is Annie Duke. And Annie is the first female World Series of Poker champion. And when she retired from playing professional poker, she went on to do some additional study and has written a number of books on decision-making science. And it's been a while ago, and I was on a webinar with her, and this was the topic. It was talking about A's, B's, and C's. And paraphrasing what Annie was discussing there is, it's really easy to see that you have an A player. I don't think anybody who's listening to this would question what an A player looks like or sounds like or how they perform. It's easy to see A and A plus performance. It's also easy to see like C and D performance, the underperforming in the situation. I'll give you some more tangible metrics on this in just a second. The difficult person, and as Annie proposed it in this discussion, the most difficult person, and also the most, what would be the right phrase for this? Sort of the person that creates the most risk in your organization is actually the B player. The B player who is stagnant represents the biggest threat in the organization, because generally they're doing enough to not get fired, which the C's and D's are getting fired. They're not doing so much that they're an A or an A plus yet. And we imagine in our minds that over time they will rise to the level of A's and A pluses. But what we also know is that time is not the only factor. They could theoretically be in your organization or in your business for 20 more years as a B player. And if they're not on some purposeful growth trajectory, the only way that they're going to grow is through trial and error, which is a very sloppy, very slow way to grow, particularly in a business like ours where you have high risk to making bad decisions, or you have high risk associated with low skill. You lose a deal, it costs you 5 figures or more. And so this idea of like, how do I identify the B players? I think that the way I would go about doing it is to say, okay, if we know what an A looks like, and if I assume for discussion purposes that most business owners are operating at a B plus level or above. Now, if they're not, that's a different story, but let's just stick with this analogy for a second. Operating at a B plus level or above, if these people aren't performing at your level, then you got a problem. And it's only an ongoing risk if they're not on a growth trajectory and you allow them to stay. The way I would also approach this, and this is more for staff members than it is for salespeople, every time you write a paycheck or every time you click a button on your payroll processing and money shoots out of your bank account, the question you're asking yourself is, did I get my money's worth? And that's a gut check question, not a mathematical formula. And there will be times, everybody's going to have bad weeks or bad months or whatever. There will be times where it's like, maybe, or there'll be times where it's like, yeah, I think so. And there are going to be times where it's like, hell yeah, I got my money's worth. And I'm looking for a lot more of those like, hell yeah, I got my money's worth. And I know that might sound like kind of a simplistic approach to it, but I actually don't think it's difficult to identify B's and C's. I think it's easy to identify them. I think it's difficult to deal with what's next, because now we're talking about interpersonal dynamics and the ickiness, and most people tend to be conflict avoidant. And I don't like fights any more than the next person does. But those are kind of the necessary things in helping people through the growth of their businesses. Almost always it comes down to people more so than tactics.
Sure. And the skill development component for those Bs, if you know, like, they're immovable people in your organization, not that they always are, but a lot of times for whatever interpersonal reason they may be. So there's always that skill development component that's important too.
Yeah. Well, let's rabbit trail on this for just a second too, because you sort of led me in this direction a minute ago. One of my favorite answers to a question is it depends, which I know can be maddening sometimes. But this is where I think our thought patterns diverge from a lot of what one might read in books or what perhaps a lot of our competitors might say. And if we're playing this longer term time horizon, so you mentioned a second ago, like helping people work through split structures and creating profit share components and stuff like that. And it's not necessarily that those are revolutionary ideas, but there is in our business particularly, there is like, here's the box around what this is supposed to look like. And if you get outside of this box, somehow you're going to be unsuccessful at the business. And I'm like, whoa, time out. Like, if I stay in that box, and because of staying in that box, I lose an A plus player who's been with me for a decade, I'm in the wrong damn box. Now, that's not to say that we need to like bend over backwards to accommodate everything, but evaluating it from all angles. And I will say more times than not, the loss of an A player or an A plus player is far more expensive than figuring out a way to keep that person in the organization.
Yeah, for sure. So from real estate professionals to elite entrepreneurs, who are the typical clients for Middleton Elite Coaching, and what do their goals usually entail?
Sheri, I think there are maybe, a handful of different types of clients that we would say are our ideal clients as entrepreneurs or business leaders. The first I might say is this emerging business leader. And they're a person that maybe they're a solopreneur, or they have a small organization, and they have this need to continue to grow because they have so much demand and or desire to grow. And they look around the industry that they're in, and then they say, I've seen a lot of people build these messy Frankensteins, and I don't really want to do that. So rather than doing that, I'm going to engage in business coaching to help me make sure I do it the right way, or to dramatically increase the likelihood that I do it the right way. There's no certainty in life, but I would say that's kind of the first person. They come to us and they're like, here's where I am. I got a good thing going. I need to make it bigger. How do I do it? So we come in at that spot. The second person is kind of the person who's built the Frankenstein. They had a good thing going. It got big. They maybe in a very sort of haphazard entrepreneurial way built a team around them, but they look up and they say something like, I don't know how I got here, but this feels harder than it used to be. I got all these people, I got all these messes, and I don't want to keep adding to it. And I'll hear people say things like, I really don't like managing people. This was way easier when it was just me, which may or may not be true. However, that usually is 5, 10, 20 people in this sort of like wobbly amoeba. And then our job is to figure out where to go from there. And sometimes it's sort of like, doing a renovation project on a house where you're like, this thing's got pretty good bones, but we're going to need to strip it back to the studs and rebuild. And we've done that a number of times where we've had to help people make some really tough decisions to take, one step back to then take 2 steps forward. The third person, I would say, kind of the ideal profile would be someone who's on the other side of the Frankenstein wobbly amoeba thing, which is a very technical coaching term, by the way. And they grew well, either because they had a good system for doing that, or perhaps they were working with someone else at the time, or they just got lucky. And now they look up and they say, I've built this really great business, but I no longer have a desire to be in the day-to-day of it. I'd like to run it as a business owner and no longer be like the top performer also, which is very common in most industries where the person that owns the business is also the top performer within it. But when there's a decoupling of that, there's an immediate impact on the net profitability of the business, because that business owner is no longer juicing the profit. So that becomes really kind of like a structural question and a mathematical question, is how does that person now step out of, quote, production, still run the business as a business owner, and still maintain a healthy enough bottom line that it's funding the life that they desire to have. And then I would say the fourth, and this is becoming more common now, and I think will become increasingly common for us over the next 5 to 10 years, and that's the person who's looking at exit strategy. And they're in the twilight of their career or approaching it, and they're saying, I built this really great thing, and it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years old, and I need a better exit strategy than like picking up the files and walking out of the office. And even better if I could find someone to acquire my business, or to partner with, or to pay me some residual or royalty. We're helping a couple of different people do this right now. And I think that's probably the biggest trend. But if you sit back and say, okay, well, that makes sense, because those are kind of the distinct phases of a life cycle of an entrepreneur-based business. And that's kind of the, I do it, and then we all do it together, and then they do it, and then somebody else does it for me. And we're jumping in at each of those points. I mean, in a perfect world, we would be taking people through all 4 of those phases, starting with them early. But in reality, we're meeting people along the trail here who might be 5, 10, 15, 20 years into that. And we're saying, okay, here's what we got. Where do we want to go, by when, and why? And then let's just figure out, like, reverse engineering. I love puzzles, for better or worse. I'm always thinking about how things work and how things fit together or could fit together better. And that applies to kind of those 4 entrepreneurial profiles.
Yeah. Yeah. And because a large part of what I do is to make your words more eloquent, I, to build on your wobbly amoeba. And I know that we help our clients launch businesses, build their businesses, scale their businesses, and hand off and or exit their businesses. And I believe we've done a really good job at the company level to adapt and to help our clients through like any market conditions or any industry related challenges that they might have. And we've certainly expanded our offerings over the last 7 years in a way that I feel is exciting. Definitely positions us to help even more people.
Sure.
Is there a method to the madness by which you created the programs and services that we offer?
None whatsoever. No.
Exactly the answer I anticipated.
Right. Yeah. No, it sounded good one day, and so we just went with it. No, all kidding aside, the short answer is yes. And I'll tell you kind of a funny story on this. If you ask the right questions, the people will tell you what they want, and they'll also tell you what they don't want. It took me a while to learn that. So here's a fun story. Circa 2017, the company was like a week old, and I had this bright idea that we were going to throw an event that fall, which was like 2 months away. And I go to the local oceanfront resort here, and I sign a contract agreement for, I don't know, $20,000 minimum or whatever the number was. We're gonna make it happen. I go to the like 11 clients that we had at the time. Like, we're gonna have an event. Bring your friends. And you could see where this is going. And it wasn't so much that the audience at that time didn't see value in an event, but the question sort of was like, well, what am I going to get at an event that I wouldn't already get from just my coaching calls with you? Somebody asked me that directly, because we didn't have any guest speakers lined up. I didn't have like an agenda lined up. It was just like, we're going to do it and we're going to figure it out. And obviously that did not work out. So I had to go back to the hotel and renegotiate the whole deal, which I was able, fortunately, to be able to do that. But the lesson there, which I think is instructive for all of us, and we, from that moment forward, have adopted this in basically everything that we've done, where we've said, here's an idea that we have. If we did the idea, what do you think? And would you participate? And oftentimes the idea, now that we've reached this size and we have this collaborative relationship, particularly with our top group of clients, is they will often come to us and say, like, here are the pain points. A friend and mentor of mine, a guy named Keith Cunningham, refers to them as quacking ducks. And so here's the analogy of quacking ducks. You're sitting down by the pond at your local city park, and the ducks are quacking, and you know what the ducks want. They want the bread or the crackers or the snack or the whatever it is that you're eating. And to the extent that we can figure out what the quacking ducks are or who the quacking ducks are, they're going to have pain points that they trust us to help them solve. And so we started as a one-on-one coaching and consulting company, and that is still the core of our business. But other things that we have spun off of that have largely been quacking duck related, or they've been things where we've said, we have this idea, but before we fall in love with our own idea and go signing $20,000 contracts at the oceanfront resort, let me get your thoughts on it. And how would you make it better? And what would you like for us to do to make it something that you would want to participate in even more? And I think there's a lot that can be highly instructive for people, particularly ideas people like myself. I often say, like, I have 99 ideas a day and maybe one of them's good. And having these kind of circuit breakers in place so we don't fall in love with our own ideas, create risk, only to then find out that our target audience didn't care.
Yeah. What were the quacking ducks for the original OGs of MEC, the client base?
Yeah, it was really the customized approach. It was the our willingness to get in the trenches and get to know them and their people and become a voice in the room and to approach this from a viewpoint of partnership, which I know a lot of people say. And I think, again, candidly, I think we do a really, really good job of this. Always room for improvement for sure. But I think the vast majority of our clients would feel like we're in it with them. And that was really what they were looking for. It wasn't an absence of like, there's a lot of great information out there, but they wanted someone, and I think still do, someone who is like on their team, in there with them, helping them work through the stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I know in the beginning of starting the company, you had that goal to stand apart from the competition. But now that we have those proven models that you mentioned needing that proof of concept, and we have an array of incredible client achievements to speak of, and we have a team of expert coaches under our belts. And again, this is not positioning us from a mountaintop, but these are things that just time and staying in the game and just continuing to drive for have given us. What do you believe still contributes or still allows us to contribute to helping the growth-minded entrepreneurs achieve their next level of success? And I emphasize the word their next level of success.
Mm-hmm. I think part of what's in the fabric of who we are is this desire to be getting better every day. And sometimes that growth is small and maybe even not noticeable, yet it compounds. Being an entrepreneur is a very dynamic space to be in. You have the dynamics of people, you have the dynamics of markets. Things are always changing. The direction of the wind is seemingly always swirling. And maybe it's the competitor in me, maybe it's the nerd in me, but us constantly looking at what's around the corner or speculating about what could be around the corner and doing our very best to prepare ourselves and our clients for that, I think creates a competitive advantage. And there have been plenty of times where, I mean, sure, we've been wrong on this from time to time, but there have been plenty of times where we have been right, and we've been right so early that it seemed wrong, which is kind of counterintuitive, I know. And I think we might be in one of those spots right now where there are a lot of changes coming in the real estate industry. And the first one is the things that are happening or soon will happen with commission rates. I think we're one of the few that are really sounding an alarm out there, not in an alarmist way. There is a distinct advantage to being prepared for something that never happens versus being unprepared for something that does. And what I think about a lot is being prepared for things that may happen with the possibility that they never do. So here's a thought experiment for you. This comes from, I really like the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. If you've never read any of Taleb, good luck, because it's a bear to read. But here's the thought concept. He wrote many books, but one of them called The Black Swan. And the general thought, paraphrasing, of course, behind black swans is that there was a long period of time, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, where people thought that swans only came in the color of white. Until one day, off the coast of Australia, I think it was, someone observed a swan that was black and totally changed the way that people thought about swans. So this idea of black swans is now very popular in investing circles, and it's used as a kind of a moniker for things that people could not see coming. But when they did, they were so disruptive to the market that it completely upended things. So one of the examples that Taleb uses that I think is very instructive is related to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And he said, let's imagine for a minute that someone could have thought of that happening. Perhaps there were people who did, but stick with me on this. That someone would have thought that terrorists hijacking commercial airliners and flying them into skyscrapers in one of the most densely populated cities in the country could happen. And they perceived the threat to be the fact that the door getting into the flight deck of the airplane didn't exist. Or if it did, it was always open and not lockable. And they felt so strongly about this that they went and said, we need to put, heavy doors with bolts, and they need to be closed so people can't get on the flight deck, and on and on. The likelihood of that being adopted would be very low for various reasons. But the other part of this, too, is an interesting thought experiment. Let's say that had happened, and as a result, 9/11, at least in that capacity, had been avoided. You'd never actually know that 9/11 had been avoided. Because you would have done the preparation that prevented something from happening, therefore it didn't, so you never really knew if it could have happened or not. Which is a really, really interesting thing to consider in this preparing for things that may or may not happen. And when you're preparing for, and this living at the coast as well, when you're doing hurricane prep and you're not in hurricane season, your neighbors look at you really funny. But when there's a hurricane bearing down on your area, it's too late to go to Home Depot. And I don't say this as an alarmist. I say this as a business strategist. There are always storms brewing. And the question just becomes, how prepared are we for them? Now, coincidentally, there just happens to be, I think, 2 really big storms brewing in the real estate industry right now. One, which we've written about extensively, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about, and that is what's likely to happen with downward pressure on commissions. And then shortly on the heels of that, we'll have a really big AI disruption. And I think both of those create fantastic opportunities for people. I think anytime there is change, there are winners. And of course, there are losers, not losers as people, just losers in the game. And so where I spend a lot of time thinking right now, and I think we spend a lot of time working with our clients right now, is the preparedness for these 2 big things that we see brewing, while also sort of navigating the day-to-day weather patterns of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, the being prepared for something that might happen versus being unprepared for something that does end up happening is so crucially important. And you're right. If I bring sheets of plywood and store them in my garage before hurricane season, my neighbor might laugh at me. But yeah, that's a great analogy there. I think one thing that you've done a wonderful job of is creating the opportunities for both our clients and for our coaches on our team as they reach pivotal points in the relationship, the coaching relationship. For example, achieving what they originally set out to accomplish through coaching. You have done a really good job of positioning and offering new opportunities to those people who might be reaching the upper echelon of their next level of success. Just to meet the changing needs of clients, I think has been incredible.
In this idea of business preparedness, I'll give you another Taleb thought that I think will resonate really well with our audience. And it's the concept of antifragility. The way Taleb describes it is that systems, businesses, people, etc., usually think in sort of 2 distinct phases. Things are either fragile, they're easily broken or disrupted, or they are resilient. Let's talk fragile and resilience for just a second. A lot of people, particularly those who are listening to this, who might have been in any sort of business during the Great Recession, probably exhibited a degree of resilience. Resilience is I'm going to grit my teeth. I'm going to put my grimace on. I'm going to just put my boots on and go to work, and I'm going to grind it out. And I would say that was largely my approach, and perhaps most people listening to this was largely the approach. Taleb, sort of poses that there's a third stage, and the third stage is anti-fragility. And anti-fragility, as he describes it, is a system or a business or a person that thrives in chaos, that takes advantage of the situation and gets disproportionate results. And I would say that the only way one can achieve anti-fragility instead of resilience is the desire and the ability to be prepared for that event. So for our real estate related audience, the questions would be, what specifically will I do to position myself such that when there is downward pressure on commission, I can use that as an opportunity to gain market share? And we wrote an extensive white paper on this topic, which we'll probably link to in the show notes. But that's moving in the way of anti-fragility. How can I take advantage of forces that are beyond my control and use that for my personal gain? Don't hear this as like taking advantage of people. Hear this as capitalizing on events that are beyond our control. So this concept of tying like black swan strategic thinking to the hurricane preparedness that then leads to anti-fragility is a piece I spend a lot of time thinking about in a way that I believe brings an interesting perspective to our clients, to be able to say, here are things that we're seeing and things that we have thought of or things that we've read that we want to bring to you, not to suggest that we're the originator of all thoughts, because we're certainly not, that you ought to be paying attention to. Now, whether you choose to do anything about it or not is up to you. It's my job to put it on your radar. It's my job to say, here's what I'd be doing or thinking if I were you, to put you more on like the anti-fragile end of the spectrum as opposed to just falling into somewhere between resilient and fragile. And I think anytime there's any sort of major disruption, fragility gets exposed, and fragility is largely because of unpreparedness. Well, I'll tell you, Sheri, the way the board of advisors came up was sort of drawing on some other experiences that I've had in life. And I'll use this analogy for you. A couple of years ago, I got really serious about golf. And I hired a golf coach who is a PGA master professional, which only a couple hundred people have reached that designation in their lives. And I went to see him for a swing analysis. I'm a pretty athletic guy, but had no real formal training in golf. And at the end of my sort of diagnostic, let's call it the launch meeting equivalent, at the end of that, he basically said, we got two options. I can teach you how to work with the janky swing that you have. Janky's my word, not his. That's not really a coaching word. I can teach you how to work with the janky swing that you have, and you'll probably be a pretty decent golfer. You're athletic enough, you could do it. Or if you want to be really good, we're going to have to start over and completely rebuild your swing. It's like, let's do it. He's like, are you sure? Like, yes, let's do it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So whether you know anything about golf or not is irrelevant. This is sort of the like strip it down to the studs and start over. And in that period, it was very important to have very regular, consistent coaching. And there were times where I might see him twice a week. And then I would get recorded videos, and I'm practicing multiple days per week to lock all of that in, and doing that for a period of about a year. Now, I'm not on this multi-decade growth journey as a golfer. The parallel, though, would be the same. Is if I'm in a phase of my business where either I'm growing into an area that I don't know much about, or I'm in the like strip it back to the studs and start over kind of phase, I'm going to need the speed that's associated with regular one-on-one, once a week, couple times a week, whatever it turns out to be, like multiple sessions per month to jump that curve to create that speed. But then at some point, one is going to find themselves in more of a maintenance mode. And it doesn't matter where in business or life that is, but in the example of my golf game, I'm sort of in maintenance mode now. I went through the rebuilding of the swing. I understand, for the most part, what it is that he wants me to accomplish. I'm very capable of practicing on my own. I'm very capable of playing well most of the time. And then I will occasionally see him for tune-up type sessions. Now, if I aspire to be a professional golfer, which I do not, it sounds sexy, but I do not, I would still be seeing him weekly, multiple times per week. I would still be practicing multiple times per week. So in your business, the question now becomes like, what's my end game here, or what am I optimizing for? If I'm still in like hyper growth mode, or if I'm in rebuild mode, I'm going to need this high frequency coaching. For a handful of our folks, though, they've reached a spot in their businesses where they don't need multiple times per week or even multiple times per month, but there is still this value in coaching and tune-ups and camaraderie, and that's how we created the board of advisors. And essentially the framework there is to take our top people who have already mastered the game at a really high level, who still have a desire to get incrementally better, but don't necessarily need the 1 or 2 sessions a week to keep them going. And we get together once per quarter in person and bring in a lot of high valued speakers who bring in interesting thoughts and ideas to it. And we make a big fun soup over a 2-day period. And then everybody goes back home and implements it in their businesses. And then we stay in touch throughout that period. And I think there's a lot of value to that, both because they tell us and also because I think a lot about what we're creating and would I want to do that? Like if I were on the other side of this, if I were a client of our company, is that something I would be attracted to or not? It's sort of like when we tell our coaching clients when they're coming up with ideas for events. They want to throw an event for their sphere of influence as a way of generating referrals. And kind of my first rule was like, don't host an event that you wouldn't want to go to. Because if you wouldn't want to go to it, chances are your people aren't going to want to go to it either. And so if we're unwilling to eat our own cooking, then we need to be cooking something else.
So because we're calling ourselves the Middleton Elite Entrepreneur, what pieces of advice would you give someone who is looking to become an elite entrepreneur?
I'd first say, Sheri, that for me, elite is a mindset and is an approach. In the early days of the company, I actually suggested to Debbie that we remove elite from the name of the company. And my concern was that people would misconstrue the word elite as elitist, and that they would assume that they only belonged here if they were on the mountaintop and had already slayed all the dragons and, rescued the princess and whatever else. And from our discussion, and I agree ultimately with her thoughts on this, which is why we left it in, is that elite is more about a pursuit of something, and it's a journey towards something where my thought would be that there's never actually a finish line. I mean, maybe there's a finish line in like this physical world. If we're playing a much longer game, there's probably even a multi-generational like legacy component of all the things that we're doing as well. Which wasn't actually your question. So your question was, how does one work on becoming elite? And I don't know that I could say for a specific person what they should do. However, I would say my approach is about getting incrementally better every day, compounded over time. And there is a piece of this that is the work that we do when nobody else is watching. And it's sort of like, let's use a gym analogy here before. A lot of people have had this experience. I know I have. You go to the gym and you do like this, just like gut busting core workout. And then the next day you go to the gym and you do a whole bunch of cardio. And the next day you do this. And the next day you do that. And you look up 5 or 6 days later. And if you're anything like me, you're super sore, glad you did the workout, and look in the mirror and there's not a noticeable difference. And that could be a little bit deflating. I do think business is like that though. I think you're going to do some gut busting core workouts and you're going to do a lot of cardio. And then one day you're going to look in the mirror and see it. Or one day somebody's going to see that in you. And they may not even know the amount of work you put in. It's like the old the old example of the iceberg, where there's like, I don't know what the number is, like 5% of the actual iceberg is above the water, or 10% or whatever the number is. And the other like 90 to 95% is under the water. I'm far more interested in what's under the water. Far more interested. And I think that's part of what we're going to be exploring a lot in this podcast, mostly because I'm a nerd about that kind of stuff. It's like, hey, high five. This is awesome what we see above the surface. What's underneath that? Like, what are you doing 10 years ago that just showed up today? And I think a lot about that for myself, because I think part of our role is to be leading from the front. And if I'm not doing that, if our coaches aren't doing that, if you're not doing that in some way, not that we have to be perfect, we just got to be purposeful about the journey. So if I were to sort of put it on a bumper sticker, I think the pursuit of elite is about being purposeful about the journey. And then at some point, we'll look up and say, really proud of what I built. I will tell you this too. Here we are 7 years into Middleton Elite Coaching. I'm really proud of what we built. I think we're going to look up 7 years from now and say, we're way better now than we were then. I look back, and I say this both humbly and accurately. I look back on some of the work that we did in the first year of the company. Am I proud of it? Yeah. Are we way better today than we were then? Absolutely. And I think we're going to be way better 7 years from now than we are today. And there's some grace in that approach. And there's also this like internal drive in that approach as well. There's another thing I'd comment on here. And this is about sort of like picking paths. And I learned this from another mentor of mine, and it served me really well. If I go back to saying, okay, I'm going to do the work, I'm going to be on this journey to becoming elite. One of the underlying principles here is it's really, really helpful to make sure that you've picked the right model. Because let's use investing as an example. So the investment fund that I've run for now going on 8 years is largely modeled after Warren Buffett's original partnerships. And the process to do that was I spent almost 2 years studying Warren Buffett before starting the fund and using Buffett as a model. And am I perfect at that? No. However, this idea of I'm going to go pursue something, whatever it is, investing, business, physical fitness, et cetera. And the first question you're starting with is like, who is my model, or what are my models? And then the pathway gets determined by the model that we're going to go into. If I had been studying an investor who, specialized in day trading, then I wouldn't be studying Buffett. It's a different investing model. People can be successful with that. That wasn't my choice. So in summary, I would say that elite is both a mindset and a journey where we're willing to get incrementally better every day. And we're focused on doing that work, even if no one's watching, and even if we're not getting the recognition for it yet, because that day will come.
Yeah, I love that. Elite being you versus you, best version of yourself, or your commitment to becoming the best version of yourself.
Right.
Awesome. Right. So I'm super excited about the podcast that we've just started.
Yeah, me too.
I'm curious to pick your brain, because you and I have talked about this for many years now, extensively, of like the idea, when it's going to happen, what we're going to do. But I've never quite asked you what inspired your idea to launch it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. It's completely selfish, I will tell you. It gives me a format to just have great conversations. So, we said at the top of this one's a little bit different because you're kind of interviewing me. What will happen in subsequent podcasts, though, is I'll be the one who's talking way less and asking really interesting people about all the stuff that lives under the tip of the iceberg. As someone who is both curious in people and curious in elite performance, I think that's going to be really fun. And even if the audience is an audience of one, or in this case, two, me and you, I think it's still going to be fun. And I know that our listeners are going to get a lot out of it as well. The other thing I'm really excited about, Sheri, is doing something in a little bit more of a long form type way. And maybe this is a point of differentiation for most people in our business. When you and I first started talking about this, and I sort of floated this idea to a number of others. I think high performers in any area have a lot to say because they have usually decades of experience. And I find it personally hard to ask someone who's got decades of experience in something to figure out a way to say all of that in a 15-minute episode or in a 30-second reel or whatever it is. Sure, there's a place for all of that. But I imagine if you took someone who's really smart and really thoughtful and has a lot of ideas that they're performing on really well, you'd probably want to spend a few hours with them. And that's where we're headed with this. Some people initially said to me, well, hey, nobody has the attention span to listen to a 3-hour podcast or a 90-minute podcast or whatever it's going to be. Like, okay, we'll see. Even if they do it in multiple increments. I think the richness of most conversations comes in the third of the conversation. And the first third is kind of the intros and the pleasantries and the 30,000 foot view stuff. And the second third is kind of where you're beginning to get into the richness of things, but it hasn't really been fully distilled yet. And then the third is kind of the gold. And I want to make sure that we're devoting enough time in this podcast to get to the third, where people who are listening to it hear from our guests, our coaches, others who will come along in the future. And they left the episode feeling like they got all that and a bag of chips. And they don't leave the episode saying, man, that was a really good 10 minutes. I wish I could listen to them more. I'm excited about that because that means I'm going to get to spend big chunks of time with really smart people like you and our coaches and other guests as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well said.
Thanks. All that in a bag of chips. Hopefully good chips.
Now I want chips.
I like garden. Yeah, I like garden salsa sun chips. Those are my go-to.
That's my favorite sun chip too.
Yeah, got it. We'd love for you to go over to MiddletonEliteCoaching.com, check out the podcast tab, and we'd love for you to submit to us any topics that you'd like for us to explore further, or if you know someone who you think would be a great guest speaker, or perhaps you might be a guest on a future podcast, we'd love to hear from you there. As you said, we've been talking about this for quite some time, and finding the space to be able to do this and to do it well has been really important. I will also say I'm pumped for our listeners and our coaches who are going to get to participate in this even further. And I think I also know that this is going to be really bad compared to what we're going to be doing a year from now. And it's going to be super fun to look back on this and say, hey, we got version 1 out the door, which is critically important. The great stuff happens at like version 3, version 4, version 5, the constant iteration. And the only way that we can do that, the only way our listeners could do that, is to get version 1 out the door. So thanks for your help in making that happen. And I'm excited what happens next.
Yeah, version 1 has been fun for me, Bill. And it just getting this out the door makes the work that we're doing in the future incrementally more fun. So here's to looking back at this episode 70, 80 episodes from now and laughing at ourselves.
Yeah, and I do feel like I should clarify something real quick before we wrap up. It's going to be bad because of me. It's not going to be bad because of you. Everything that you're going to do is going to be perfect. But I'm going to look back on this and say, come on, Middleton, you could have done way better than that. And we got version 1 out the door.
Indeed, we did. And it's like looking back at your YouTube videos from like a year ago and being like, oh, amateur.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Well, thanks, Sheri. It's been fun.
It has been. See you soon.
Well, that's a wrap for today. I trust you came away with ideas to ponder and actions to take. I know I did. Before you go, please be sure to subscribe to the Middleton Elite Entrepreneur on your favorite platforms. And if you like what we're doing, please leave us a review. It really helps us spread the word to more people just like you. Finally, you can learn more about the work we do in coaching and consulting entrepreneurs by visiting us at MiddletonEliteCoaching.com, where you'll find thoughtful commentary I write for our blog, info on upcoming live events, and tons of free resources to help you grow your business. Again, that's MiddletonEliteCoaching.com. Until next time, be elite.